On this episode of the WildFed podcast,
I wanted to talk about the wild leek controversy.
People say that ramps are endangered. That is totally inaccurate. It doesn't even represent the truth, not even remotely.
The idea that it wouldn't be a traditional food doesn't really make sense. It's clearly delicious and was done pretty sustainably.
Wild leeks are an aggressive colonizer.
What happens when you thin leek populations to increase vegetative growth and actually end up with more bulbs eventually?
I know that it might not be a popular thing to say, but I think that there should be some sort of licensing for foraging.
And again, my concern is nuance. Regulating foraging in some kind of hopefully nuanced way, it's inevitable, I think.
We almost have a mission as people in this space to make sure we plant a lot of edible perennial species and get them out on the landscape so that when soils do finally give out, there are still foods available for the people that are here to eat.
episode 134 of the WildFed podcast, Just One Leaf with Clay Bowers, is brought to you by Surthrival. Right now at surthrival.com, all elk antler products are 20% off with the coupon code STRONG20. These extracts are made with the freshly harvested velvet antler of free-ranging American elk and are one of the world's richest sources of growth factors. Humanely harvested in slaughter-free facilities, Surthrival's elk antler products are made using the same method developed and studied in Soviet-era Russia and used for their elite athletics and military programs. Known for encouraging anabolism, oxygen utilization, enhancing growth and recovery, repairing tissue damage, and stimulating immunity, elk antler is one of the natural world's most unique nutritional supplements. Head over to surthrival.com where you'll find an incredible product lineup. Supplements like immune-fortifying colostrum and medicinal mushrooms, testosterone-boosting pine pollen extracts, and naturally derived vitamin D3 with K2. Again, the coupon code STRONG20 gets you 20% off elk antler products until May 22nd. Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Hey, are you a small business owner in the wild food space or a hobbyist forager looking for a side hustle? Then listen up. This episode's brought to you by Foraged Market, a website for buyers and sellers of wild and specialty foods from around the globe. Think Etsy, but for foods with a story. But it gets better. Not only do you get your own product page to promote your goods, they expose you to a constant stream of ideal buyers, foodies, chefs, and restaurants looking for raw ingredients or value-added products just like yours. Go over to foraged.market/wildfed to get started. While you're there, you'll also find a coupon for $10 off your first order of any of the incredible products there from other sellers. Foraged.market. Buy there, sell there, and learn more about their incredible vision and conservation ethic by listening to episode 122 of the WildFed podcast. Foraged.market, the global marketplace for wild and specialty foods. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. My guest today is Clay Bowers of KnowMeForager.com. Clay's a wild food enthusiast and educator in northern Michigan who teaches foraging classes and workshops and writes about foraging on his blog and social media. He's come on the show today to discuss the increasingly contentious issue of ramp foraging, or wild leeks as we like to say in my neck of the woods. This plant is probably one of the best-known wild edibles in the U.S. for both foragers but also culinary professionals who pay top dollar to get them on their menus each spring. In the commercial market, a ramp, a member of the alliums or onion family, is a pungent bulb with 2 or 3 leaf blades attached that when cooked are surprisingly sweet. They're wonderful sautéed, roasted, or grilled and make incredible pesto-like oil preserves. But their popularity has come at a cost, with the ever-present concern of overharvest looming over this delicious spring ephemeral. As a result, a new ramp foraging ethic has emerged, which suggests harvesters take only 1 leaf per plant and leave the bulbs in the ground. This leaves another leaf or 2 for the plant to continue to photosynthesize and the bulb to continue living in the ground. But Clay, along with some other prominent foragers in the densest part of leek country, have been challenging this only one leaf per plant conservation ethic, suggesting that it's unnecessarily restrictive and might even be stymying the productiveness of ramp colonies. Now, I want to say up front, living in a place where ramps are scarce and colonies are small, I subscribe to and even promote the one leaf idea. I take one leaf per plant because the stands of wild leeks I harvest from could easily and quickly be denuded by overzealous harvesters. And when they're found by commercial harvesters, they are often overexploited. But not everyone lives at the extreme ends of this plant's range, and so for those in areas of greatest ramp density, this rule is not only unnecessary, it can seem like a pretentious encumbrance dreamt up by hall monitoring ecological do-gooders. Of course, like most conservation issues, there's a lot of nuance here to be unraveled. So as a one-leaf guy, I thought it'd be fun to talk to Clay, who's more of a bulb and all kind of guy. Not to determine who's right and who's wrong, because it's not that simple, but more to get a sense of when a one-leaf approach might be warranted and also when taking the bulb and all might be more beneficial to a stand of plants. Perhaps, too, it's worth mentioning that we're still foraging in a very unregulated environment. Hunting, by contrast, has become, and born out of necessity, a very controlled harvest, with each legally hunted species getting its own harvest regulations based on its unique life cycle and population dynamics. And while I suspect we'll see foraging regulated more broadly in our own lifetimes, at present we, as harvesters, are currently responsible for regulating our own harvests. It's a big responsibility, and because personality types differ wildly, it's unlikely we'll come to any kind of consensus about best practices anytime soon. So for that reason, hearing all the sides of an argument in a dialectic manner, in other words, searching for what's most true versus what we most want to be true, is a wise approach. While we won't all arrive at the same conclusions, hopefully our individual assessments will contribute not just to conservation, but to increasing our botanical resources. One day we'll tell the kids how we used to forage without a license, and they'll have a hard time imagining it, just like when we read about the unregulated days of the market hunts. For now, though, let's all make wise decisions. The future of our unique and ancient passion depends on it. Clay Bowers, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back on, Daniel.
Oh, man, I was just over on your Instagram. I don't know, I guess I missed your April Fool's joke, and I just was watching it. Feces fecaloides.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty funny, man. So you were pretending you're out there with like one of those dog poop bags that people bring out on the trails, picking up with like a little shovel, and you're pretending it's this mushroom. Feces fecaloides. Dude, very funny. You're sort of the smartass of the foraging world. Is that fair to say?
Sure. I like to. I kind of like to feel that way a little bit. I like to even when I write my blogs, I like to kind of say things that are funny in them.
Yeah, I appreciate your humor, man. For folks who might not have heard your last show or don't know you, let's give a little context to who you are and what you do out there, and then I want to get into our topic today, which I think is kind of amusing and a little prodding as well.
Sure. My name is Clay Bowers. I'm a forager and a slightly less of a hunter that lives in the northwest corner of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. I have been foraging for somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 or 17 years. I am absolutely obsessed with it. I try to basically eat as many wild foods as possible in my diet. I like to, and that includes fishing, hunting too, but a lot
trapping as well, right? I see you beaver trapping quite a bit.
Yes. Actually, in the last year, though, I have not done as much trapping. I only got one beaver in the last season.
Mm. And then also you teach foraging up there as well, right?
Yes, I teach up here. I also teach in all over Michigan, in fact. And then I just started in the last 2 years traveling out of state to teach. So I taught a class in Kentucky last year. I taught one in southern Indiana this year.
Oh, congratulations, man. That's cool. Yeah, Kentucky's a surprisingly rich foraging ground, I found.
I I completely agree. It was one of the coolest places I think I've ever got to teach a class in.
Yeah. I wanted to talk today about, it's funny. I think if you weren't in the foraging world, then the following comment would sound kind of silly, but I wanted to talk about the wild leek controversy. Like it's such a niche world we're in, so those, if you know. But there's been this big movement in the last few years, I guess, pushback against commercial foraging of leeks, which obviously runs the risk of, once you commodify something, we run the risk of the tragedy, the commons, or just straight up, stripping areas of wild leeks. And there's been this, idea of two things I see. One is the people shouldn't harvest them at all. And another one is one leaf at a time, which I've been doing here in Maine. And we'll get into the nuance of that in a little bit. But you have just been pushing back against that in a way that's kind of cracking me up. So I wanted to give space for the other side of that argument, which is a super valid and important one. But why don't we give a little context first? Why don't you riff about leeks a little bit? Let's talk about what leeks are, who they are, kind of what you know about them, just so that we set the stage for folks who might not be familiar with them from a foraging perspective.
Okay. Wild leeks, also known as Allium tricoccum, are a member of the onion family. They are abundant in the eastern half of the United States. They are extraordinarily abundant in certain parts of their range, and they have a rich historical pattern of use all across their range, including harvesting of the bulbs, which is why I've had this kind of idea for a long time now that this whole only take leaves thing doesn't even fit with the historical context, because people will try to say things like, oh, well, Native Americans didn't even use the bulbs, when in fact, if you look up the have you ever seen Native American Ethnobotany, the book?
No.
Okay, Native American Ethnobotany is a book by Daniel Mowerman, and in there's a bunch of entries about the wild leeks and their uses by historical cultures, and you have ample evidence of historic and present-day use of ramps by Menominee, Cherokee, Iroquois, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and they're all using the bulbs.
I'd like to just jump in on that. When I think about leeks in the, springtime, you take that plant out of the ground, you got the bulb and then the beautiful green, 2 to 3 leaves usually. And after you remove that little root cap, the entire plant is deliciously edible.
Yes.
And I can't think of too many plants that are like that, where you can pull up the whole root and leaves and cook the whole thing, and it's like a food. It's like a unusually edible plant. The idea that anybody would just eschew eating the bulbs, that doesn't really. I can see people's reasoning for doing that, from a conservation perspective, but the idea that native peoples wouldn't have eaten that doesn't even compute. I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense. It's like, it doesn't make sense. And those those like things that people say, well, the Native Americans, it's like it gets pretty old, right? The Native Americans used every part of every edible. We hear those kind of things all the time, and it's like, it's pretty crude and lacks resolution. But yeah, the idea that it wouldn't be a traditional food doesn't really make sense. It's clearly delicious to eat, and was done pretty sustainably. In fact, beyond sustainably, it was done in a way that created a tremendous amount of surplus, right?
Yeah, I would say that there's a couple things there. First of all, there was far less people around then, so that does play a role. And I will be the first person to actually admit that leeks look different, or ramps look different in different habitats. So where you live, obviously that is the right strategy for maintaining a sustainable harvest in your area. But where I live, where Sam Thayer lives, and where certain other people live, where there's so much, I can literally walk 2 minutes from my door to a beech maple forest that is an entire carpet of wild leeks, right from where I'm recording right now.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say that it's different in different places, and to pretend that it is not, that it's the same everywhere is just false, and it gives an unfortunate like picture of reality to people who might not know any better, especially online.
Where I'll give you a bit of a confession too from my side. So some of the richest leek foraging in Maine here, because Maine, we live on the extreme outer, northeastern margin of leek habitat. So we have about 100 colonies of plants, and some of them are, less than 100 individuals, as I understand it anyway. So we take one leaf partially because we do have commercial foragers here. We're trying to preserve the colonies that we have. But another thing is that the richest foraging I'm aware of in Maine is on the Androscoggin River, which was heavily polluted by the paper industry, by the paper mills here. And a lot of those toxins are still in the root mass of the plants. And so the aerial portions of the plants don't carry some of those toxic compounds up above the soil line. So one of the reasons we take one leaf is to preserve the bulbs, but another reason is because, some of our foraging grounds, which are traditional foraging grounds, close to some very significant, former native settlements, where clearly these leek colonies were cultivated in some way, or they were, definitely cared for, intended. If I could take bulbs there without a concern about the toxicity of them, I would. It's not just the fact that we're trying to conserve, because it's rich enough there, like you said. I mean, it's acres and acres and acres of nothing but leeks and other, spring ephemerals, and so a lot of times maybe there's other reasons too, if that makes sense.
Yep. No, I totally get it. It's the same reason that when I catch suckers, I remove the skin and all the fat, and I don't take the head and any of that stuff because of pollution.
Yep. Yeah, great. So why don't you explain a little bit about the commercial forage too? I want to make sure we get full context. I don't want to assume anybody really knows what we're talking about, and there's a lot to this story. So when I think about plants that make it, obviously a lot of fungi makes its way into the commercial market by commercial foragers. But when I think about plants, ramps are probably one of the most sought after wild edibles for chefs in the restaurant industry. And so it's not uncommon this time of year actually see ramps in the supermarket, see them on the roadside for sale, see them in a Whole Foods. They're very popular. They're one of those wild foods that foodies are aware of. And want to get access to. And that means, of course, there's an army of foragers out there harvesting them. And that has in some way impacted, I think, how people see this issue. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit as well, or like to what degree you think that's impacted this issue.
I think that it has played a little bit of a role in it, but I think that it's overstated. And here's why I will tell you why. The majority of people that are on Instagram reading these posts about foraging, they're living in cities. And unfortunately, a lot of these city folks tend to have a view of nature that is not like the reality of nature, like where I live, for instance. So you live in a small town, right?
I'd say about 5,000 people. Yep.
Okay, well, I live in a slightly bigger, so there's like 25,000 people where I live, but I'm absolutely surrounded by nature. And oftentimes, I'll say the three species that I encounter this sort of argument with the most: Leeks, Allium tricoccum, Inonotus obliquus, which is chaga.
Wait! I want to go back to it. You almost called it Chewbacca, and I think there's there's a meme there, and I want to see you produce it eventually.
Okay, well, yep. So Chewbacca or chaga, yeah.
Yeah, I've been called a chaga hacker I have the distinct honor of having been called a chaga hacker by probably the most famous mycologist in the United States. I'll leave it at that.
Wow. Okay. So the other species is cattails. So the Typha latifolia.
People really have cattails?
Yeah. Well, and this is why I told you, if you have a look at your environment around you and then you superimpose that onto everybody else's landscape, what you end up with is a view that is false about the way the world looks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. I'm like, cattails seems so abundant and common. I can't imagine people could have a very long-lasting negative impact by foraging them. But wow.
Well, let me give you some context for that. So cattails in southern Michigan are imperiled by two things. One is the non-native Phragmites, which are taking over all the wetlands. And then the other is Typha angustifolia, which is our non-native cattail. That's the narrow-leaf cattail.
Okay, got you.
So those people that live in southern Michigan, and I used to live in southern Michigan as well, so I can speak to this, they say there's no cattails, you shouldn't be harvesting cattails. But that's another plant. I can walk outside my door, walk a few minutes, and I can find thousands and thousands of acres of cattails.
Okay. Can I add one species to your list that I think deserves to be on there?
Sure.
Milkweed. Because of the monarch butterflies, Clay.
Yeah. Actually, I was just teaching a class the other day, and I had a student tell me that I shouldn't advocate for eating of milkweed because the monarchs need it. And I went into this whole spiel about how I've actually monitored the patches, and the patches that we eat from have more monarchs on them than less.
Wow. Yeah. And I want to be clear here too. Like, I fully respect the arguments people make, and I have a lot of room for the conversation, but it is annoying when someone just who's uneducated on the topic tells you what you should do rather than says like, hey, could we discuss monarchs? I just want to make sure that this is sustainable. Like, that's something that I can really, understand. But when people come on my page and they're like, you should never do that because monarchs, it's like, okay, yeah. You're just kind of shutting down the conversation here.
Well, and then back to the main subject. So ramps, I have been steadily being blocked by certain Instagram pages over the last couple of days because I've actually seen people say literally that ramps are endangered across 90% of their range. That was one quote from one of the posts that I commented on. And that is totally inaccurate. It doesn't even represent the truth, not even remotely. It's actually only threatened in 3 states, which are Maine, Rhode Island, and Tennessee.
Yeah, let's point out that term endangered actually does mean something. And so yes. I think sometimes you'll hear folks throw it around a little indiscriminately. And I understand why. It's not like everybody's got ecological. I know I didn't grow up with an ecological background and have had to kind of, I'm an autodidact, so I've had to like teach myself and learn from some incredible mentors. But I can understand that folks don't always realize that. But it's kind of like maybe it's like using the term wilderness, where it's like there's like a federal definition for what wilderness is. And then there's like what most people mean. And so I think when we say endangered, that's like there's like a federal legal meaning for that. And then there's sort of like a conversational meaning, and people might get them confused a little bit when they apply it to ecology.
Yes. I would just say that I like to stick to the idea that endangered is a definition that has a meaning, and it means it is very imperiled. Mm-hmm. There's not that many of them left.
Right.
And for wild leeks, that is just totally inaccurate.
Mm-hmm. The accounts that have been blocking you, have they been blocking you because of posts of you foraging leeks, or have they been blocking you because of like specific comments you've made or memes you've posted?
Well, so I don't have a gigantic following on Instagram, but of the following I do have, I think people have kind of gotten to know me and my views on leeks. And so I have people send me posts all the time of other foragers when they make these ridiculous claims. And so I've been getting a lot of those lately, and I'll go on to them and I try to politely comment and say, I'm just looking for the proof that you have. You say that this plant is endangered. I would love to see if you have any proof. And largely what I've gotten back is either getting my comments deleted or being blocked outright, and then being told that even if it is called an IUCN species of least concern, then them telling me, oh, that's just the label that colonizers use.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that's tough because, all right, so the IUCN, it's very politically motivated, right? Like there's stuff I'll see on there because from the animal side, the hunt side, they'll list things as imperiled or endangered that aren't, and they do it for political reasons. And so that red list, the IUCN Red List, it's hard because sometimes I want to reference it, and sometimes I feel like, is it good to give this thing more credibility? Because I've found it to be a little hit or miss. But when something on there is listed as least concern, typically it is, right? It's usually the other way. If they have a bias, it's towards, making something sound worse than it is, not better. So least concern means that like we have the least concern about this species status, like it's doing great. And that's usually pretty accurate. I hadn't actually looked it up. So that's how leeks are listed there.
From all I can find on IUCN is that, yes, it is a species of least concern. And as I mentioned before, the only 3 states where it is listed as threatened and not endangered is Maine, Rhode Island, and Tennessee.
Yeah, we tried to, because I've got a good friend who is an artist, and he had done a fantastic piece. Philippe is his name. Did a fantastic piece at Herbaceous Human, his Instagram, of a guy cutting, and it showed sort of a one leaf at a time diagram. And we reposted that recently because we live in a place that's like that. And I also think no harm comes of that. Like if you decide to take one leaf and leave the rest of the plant, you're certainly not doing anything bad. It's more like if you go around telling people what they should or shouldn't do. So we try to draw the distinction about living in a place where that's important. And I think one of the things, and I kind of hear this in the subtext of a lot of what you talk about, people really struggle with nuance, right? We live in this like propaganda rich environment where everything is really black and white. And this is like a nuance thing. And it's hard for people to accept that you can have one practice in one place and a different practice in another place because of, this thing called nuance.
Yeah. I would actually love to speak on that for a minute. The last couple of years has been really demonstrative of groupthink and all the horribleness that comes along with groupthink. And I would say actually the last 10 years has been leading up to this point. You have social media, which is easy to spread information that can be not true. And then you get people saying things that are like maybe a famous Instagram forager. They say these things and then people just go with it instead of like having a thought like, oh, maybe that's not true. Maybe I should look it up. So groupthink tends to dominate in this whole landscape. And it's not just confined to wild foods. This is confined to everything. It seems like nuance is just going out the window. We're driving down the road. We're about to fly off the cliff. Just throw the nuance out on the way, I
saw a t-shirt that the guys over at Meat Eater did that said pro nuance. I don't know if they still sell it, but like I really appreciated that because especially when you start talking about the distribution and population of species, because there's always a margin where the species is rare, right? It's like in the center of that distribution, you're going to be like, hey, there's a lot of them here. And as you get out to those edges, it's going to get like that. And so that's normal. And it does make sense to me that people at the edges of a species distribution should probably be, or a range, I should say. I'm saying distribution. I should be saying range. So at the edges or margins of the range, you should probably be thoughtful about it. But if you live in the center where there's at least concern about it because the species is really rich there, you could have a different practice. That makes so much sense to me. But it obviously takes some critical thinking, and then you have to actually decide where you fit into that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that there's another thing at play, which is that people have an idea, and I used to struggle with this myself. I used to think that because garlic mustard or Japanese knotweed aren't that bad here where I live, that must mean that they're really not as bad elsewhere. And then let me just give you the example. When I came out to Maine a couple of years ago and we missed each other because you were on vacation somewhere else, I got to see the Japanese knotweed that invades your guys' landscape over there.
Particularly our riparian areas, our floodplains, man, it's bad.
Yeah, and it changed my whole view. I was actually kind of like, wait a minute, this is really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that sort of nuance only kind of comes with experience, right? So if you have somebody that's only been foraging for 5 or 6 years and they have only experienced their environment, they can get this sort of tunnel vision about their landscape and about how it looks everywhere else.
Something my wife and I have been talking about, we grew up in a generation where it was pretty normal to go traveling at some point in your life. And, she and I both got to travel, around the world, I guess, just as young people in our 20s. And we're noticing that a lot of young people today aren't doing that. And it's just what you're talking about. You develop a much broader understanding of the world. You get exposed to, not just other cultures, but like the culture shock thing where where you realize, sort of similar to you seeing how it was different with Japanese knotweed, where you go like, oh, not everybody lives like this. Oh, not everybody thinks like this. Oh, not everybody eats like this. Oh, not everybody's exposed to these same things. And that's really humbling. And it helps you understand your place in the world a little bit, and maybe that your point of view isn't necessarily the right point of view. And I do kind of have some, I don't know, not like concerns, but it's just like I feel a little bad for young folks today who don't get to travel as much, or where there's less of that going on, because I think it's really important to developing a broader worldview. I mean, you just gave a great example. You go somewhere else and you realize that, the way it looks where you live is not how it looks everywhere else, and so it kind of keeps you from making definitive statements, right? When you realize like you've been wrong about something or saw it wrong, and then it's like humbling, and it's like, oh man, I should be careful. I'll be more careful next time.
Yeah, I actually grew up a few years behind you, and my experience with the world was largely the same. I lived in Mexico in 2005 and 2006. I hitchhiked all over the country and all over Mexico.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
And I have a lot of different views came to me as a result of that. And I feel like I've just had a whole entire life of always being that annoying person that's asking why.
Yeah.
And my family can all attest to this. And they tell me that I'm a lot more tolerable now than I was when I was younger.
It gets better with age, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, that's what basically got me to where I am with the wild leek debate is that I actually will totally admit to this. 5-6 years ago, I hopped on the 1 leaf per plant train.
Oh, the big reveal.
Yeah. And then I was on the 1 leaf per plant train. And then I started to question. I said, wait, why am I even saying this? Because like the place that I live is so abundant that I don't need to do this.
I'm picturing that meme you made. It's like Clark Kent from the new Marvel series, and he's like doing an interview, and Jason Momoa, Aquaman, is like sneaking up behind him. And what's your caption say there?
It says, I believe, I don't have it in front of me. I believe that the Clark Kent is saying 1 leaf per plant harvesters, and then Jason Momoa is coming up behind him, and it says Sam Thayer's upcoming documentary.
Because it does seem like a lot of folks who are connected with Sam are aware of this piece he's producing. I guess documenting some of the work he's done, sort of scientifically looking at what happens when you thin leek populations by removing bulbs, and doing some experiments to see if you can actually increase productivity by taking some I'm saying it how I understand it, but maybe you could correct the record if I'm saying it wrong. But basically looking at like how many plants you can take per square foot to increase vegetative growth and actually end up with more bulbs eventually, right?
We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, I'm proud to announce that we've recently started filming for Season 3 of WildFed on the Outdoor Channel, which should start airing beginning of 2023. But until then, Season 2 of WildFed is now on the air. From the 17-year periodical cicadas of Brood 10 to giant Atlantic bluefin tuna to the bison of Standing Rock's Great Plains, Season 2 of WildFed is filled with unique hunts, forages, and incredible wild harvested meals, and no shortage of adventure. Watch Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and again at 10:30 p.m. on Outdoor Channel. Hey, if you don't have cable, you can still watch the show live as it airs on friendlytv.com. That's spelled friendly without vowels, FRNDLY TV.com. You can get a free trial subscription if you want to watch season 2, and after that, it's just $6.99 per month. Here at WildFed, we're so proud to have a second season on the air, and we really hope you'll tune in either on Outdoor Channel or friendlytv.com. Now, back to the show.
Yes. So that was something that I started to notice all on my own independently of Sam. And then Sam started telling me over the last couple of years, we'd have these long phone conversations and he would tell me about his experiments that he was doing and how he had come to these conclusions that actually wild leeks are an aggressive colonizer and they're not actually that dainty like they're often portrayed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started to have those conversations, and then I started to go out with a new set of eyes on the landscape. And I'm telling you, Daniel, everywhere I go now in my area, I notice it. It's like last year there was a place that we harvest leeks from. It's a private patch, but they logged in there and they had tractors running all over. It was destructive. There's trees down all over the place. They weren't very tidy. And this year it seems like there's actually more leeks than last year.
Okay, wow. They're taking advantage of disturbance basically, and probably more light coming in.
Well, I don't know that they necessarily need light, nor do I think that they actually like light necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe they thrive under a canopy.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that they can't live in light. It just means that they kind of thrive there.
Mm-hmm.
But what I have noticed is when you look out at the landscape up where I live and where Sam lives, is that these disturbed areas are often extraordinarily rich. Like you have dirt roads that go through the forest here, like the Manistee National Forest.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see along the dirt road, rich patches of leeks.
Wow. I can't picture them along the side of the road. My main brain can't handle that.
Yeah. They are just, like I said, extraordinarily abundant. I have 2 private land patches that I harvest from, and both of them, we take over 100 pounds a year.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah,
both of them. And the one is acres and acres and acres, like 100 acres. I could never, ever put a dent in that population. But I will say that I've noticed where I dig in that 100-acre patch, it's only getting bigger and bigger. Like the leeks themselves become bigger, but then the population itself becomes more dense.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things that's going on here is people sometimes want to like really oversimplified rules too. And so, something that the foragers that I talk to who are more experienced, they almost always say the same thing. Like, oh, I hate those like foraging rules. I don't really believe in them because you'll have the like 10% or 30% or whatever rules, only take 10%, only take 30% rules, people will say. And it's difficult for people to imagine leaving it up to others to just decide on their own what's appropriate. Unfortunately, that is kind of like when it comes to tending a landscape, though, that is kind of important. And it's just so different than it is like as a hunter or a trapper or an angler. These decisions are all made for you largely. Obviously there's nuance there too, but you have some pretty strict rules and they're species by species. And those rules are designed by biologists who do have a sense of nuance. They're far from perfect rules, but people are used to getting the rule book or looking up the rules and it's like, they're laid out for you. And then when we forage, we're on our own. And so, you have some folks in the world are extremely conservative and some folks are extremely liberal, and there's a huge spectrum in between. And so, you've got everything from a person who's coming in and maybe going to take everything that they see, and a person who's coming in and they're upset that you even want to harvest anything, right? So there's this spectrum, and the idea that we can just trust people to make decisions, well, that's kind of scary because the condition of the world today is largely because people have been allowed to do whatever they want. So, how do you kind of reconcile that? And like, is there any kind of, general guidelines that you have, or how would you like to see this narrative modified a little bit to reflect the reality of what you're seeing in the foraging grounds?
Well, first of all, I think that it needs to be place by place and not just an overarching rule above everywhere. And I would say that personally, Sam has stated to me, and I'm sure he stated it to many other people, that if you leave 4 per square foot, that is enough to increase regeneration, that they can be sustainable.
Wow.
So I actually say you should leave more than that. I say 5 to 10 per square foot, 5 being the minimum. But honestly, he's the lifelong foraging expert. So I'm being actually a little bit more precautious than he is, and he's the one who's got more evidence and has actually done these scientific experiments, and he says 4 per square foot.
That's interesting. Yeah, over the years, as you kind of just allude to, his name gets dropped on this podcast probably more than anybody as like the definitive authoritative voice. And he's such a humble dude. It's not like he's out there telling people what to do. It's just that he's so well respected in the space. But that is interesting. He's saying 4 plants, and for you, that's like you're more conservative than that. So that's kind of telling. It's like probably very few of us would be comfortable leaving. But now that said, he's talking about that. He's doing this on his own property, right? Not a place that's shared to other foragers, really.
Yeah. So there's a couple things here. First of all, I forgot to mention this earlier, but so wild leeks and all onion species, they reproduce by seed, but then the other method of reproduction is by division. So that is what Sam said. When he says 4 per square foot, he's talking about you're relying on the division to make it so that next year there's going to be 8 leeks there. And then if you leave the ones that have seed heads on them, then there's going to be more than 8 there next year, right? So this is the things that I've seen. There's another woman, Maureen Gordon. She's Food, Forage, and Fodder on Instagram.
Oh yeah. We talk a lot.
Yeah, so she's had the exact same things, seen the same things on her land. So everybody is coming to these conclusions on their private patches. Now, as far as like a public land patch goes, I don't know how you could do that, because I'm going to tell you that even though you're supposed to leave 4 or 5 per square foot, I think that no matter what, like what you alluded to a minute ago, is that humans can be greedy, and they would come in there and say there's only 4 or 5 per square foot left over. I don't trust people to actually keep to that rule. I think that they would end up taking them anyway.
This is a tough one. I just want to, with some like balancing, like being a misanthrope with being truly compassionate towards others, right? And like suspecting there too. So I'm gonna try to balance these two things. On the one hand, I think people are generally pretty good, outside of, your sociopaths and psychopaths. I think most people are pretty good. That said, let's say you're getting $2.50. Let's say you're getting $2 per leek when you sell them in market. Okay, so if I go around and I stick 2 $1 bills and I do that four times in a 1 square foot, are you going to walk by that and not pull those dollar bills? It's like probably not, right? Like this is such a tough economic environment and it's so competitive. I just can't, it's hard to picture somebody in a public set. Like again, let's say it's your own land and you harvest off your own land and you sell into the market. I think you'd be much more incentivized to think long-term. But then when you go into a public space and you think, well, if I don't do it, the next person's going to do it. So, exactly. And that's both the tragedy of the commons, but it's also a little bit of greed. It's it's distrust. It's all those kind of things. And it's not necessarily untrue. And that's something I don't know how we reconcile that. And sometimes I wonder, like, because surely like me, you've been noticing over the last few years, there's folks who think we shouldn't be foraging at all. I never really I never encountered that until recently. And it seems like only in the last few years I've been starting to hear that narrative, and that because it used to be if you foraged, people thought that was so cool, and now people are starting to act like you're raping the landscape. And it's like, whoa, man, hold on, there's a lot to this. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure how we reconcile this because I don't have a private leek patch. I got to go to a place that's shared with a lot of folks, and I like eating leeks every year. And I'm very, very careful and judicious. And I'm in a position where I can leave $2 in the ground like that, but not everybody is, And so I don't know what we do. It's complicated.
It is very complicated, and I would say that honestly, I know that it might not be a popular thing to say, but I think that there should be some sort of licensing for foraging. Yeah. And I know that there are a lot of foragers out there who totally disagree with me. But I think because me and you also share the same background of being hunters as well, that me and you are kind of used to buying tags, and I would buy tags for foraging as well if I had to. And in fact, every year I have to buy tags when I go to Minnesota to harvest rice.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I had somebody, I get occasionally a little bit of like bitter mail, from folks who don't like something I've said on the show. I mean, mostly not, but every once in a while. And I had somebody write recently, just kind of, you could just tell, like pretty emotional about me talking about regulating foraging. And, they gave me kind of a libertarian argument, which I understand. And I don't disagree. I think that the world is becoming hyper-regulated, over-regulated. In a lot of ways. I believe in liberty. I believe in freedom, all those kind of things. Like that's a big part of who I am. At the same time, I'm really glad that the game here is managed because I just think there would be very little left if it wasn't. And I like the idea that the system that we have with all its imperfections, noted, of course, that it goes back into conservation. That feels good to me. Again, even though it's not perfect, even though there's a lot of issues and we could spend all day pointing them out, it's still like it works pretty well. And when you look around the world at the state of hunting, it's like, oh, I get it now. The reason, Canadians and U.S. citizens can hunt as freely as we can is because of how managed it actually is. And,
Yes.
A lot of places in the world are not like this. And most places have massively depleted their hunting opportunities and game opportunities. And all that's left is poaching. And it's just a terrible situation. So now that I start to see pressures on foraging, and occasionally I'll hear about places where there's talk of banning foraging altogether or laws that, seem to be made haphazardly, I think, man, I'm open to conversation about managing this. And again, my concern is nuance, because when I do see foraging managed in some limited capacities, I worry about nuance. Are they going to be just sweeping regulations, or is there somebody who really understands this stuff? Or, hopefully there's an open dialogue, because I'd hate there to be silly laws that keep us from doing things. But I think we do. I agree with you. I think we start needing them. How do you picture that happening, though?
I don't know how I would picture that happening, but to speak to the silly laws thing, I think that we would absolutely go there. I think that would be something that unfortunately would definitely take place. Just on Earth Day, as an example, I saw conservation groups that would probably be helping in making these regulations. I saw conservation groups planting trees that are not native to where I live in northern Michigan. Wow. And then I saw them planting, hickory trees, which are not native here, 5 feet apart. And so like you do kind of develop this sort of like idea, like, holy cow, like the inmates are running the asylum here.
Again, we're talking about such a niche thing that some people would be like, that sounds great. We're coming from such like a educated spot in a really tiny niche that but yeah, I hear you. But hey, I mean, you're not going to hate having hickory trees if any of them make it to maturity.
Well, so the thing is, just as like a little side tangent here, hickory trees are not native here because of the temperature. Everybody in northern Michigan thinks that hickory trees don't grow here because we have such cold winters, and that's not it at all. Our entire northern half of our state had sand pushed on it from the glaciers, and so the entire thing is covered in sand. So plants that live up here are specialists on growing in sand, and hickories aren't not keen on growing in pure sand.
So they're not going to be able. It's not just the 5 foot increments, but they're not going to be able to grow there. You think long term?
Well, they can grow. There's a couple places where people have planted them a long time ago, but the thing that you always see is there's big tall trees, right? But then no babies around it. Now, why are there no babies?
Yeah.
Because the babies don't have the appropriate nutrients to grow into a big tree from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
that's again goes with the whole nuance of knowing your land, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but as far as the regulations goes, I believe that we just have to regulate it like we regulate other things. You could have a general forager's license, like maybe a mushroom picking license, maybe a general foraging for plants license. Maybe you have to take a course, you know, to get that license, like the same way you do with hunter safety.
I like that a lot. I think that that'd be fantastic if people received a baseline education on, let's say, fungi and botanicals or something. I mean, that's a really good start.
Yeah, and the thing is that people complain about that, like libertarians, and just like you said, I'll echo the same thing. Like I love freedom, but I don't want to live in a place that has no plants that I can forage, either because we look at nature as if it's some sort of artifact, or because it's been so like plundered that there's nothing left to forage.
Yeah, and also for me, being able to hunt and forage is a kind of freedom.
Yep.
So let's say then, in the name of freedom, I lose that ability. So I lose like a true fundamental human freedom, so that I can have the freedom to do that. I don't know. It doesn't make sense, So right, and it's like, but the challenge that I think of when I imagine regulating it is that you'd need a kind of a law enforcement wing. So we have the warden service for animals, but the wardens really only need to know the game species. So let's say in your state that's, a dozen and a half species that are regulated or something, or 24 species or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, they can memorize that, and they
Hmm.
can easily identify them. It's not hard to say like that's a white-tailed deer, that's a raccoon. Like we don't see the same challenges in game animal identification that we see in botany or that we
Yep.
see in mycology. So, being able to identify all the edible species of a mushroom in your state, well, that's a highly specialized knowledge. That is very different than what the law enforcement wing of a Fish and Game Service has to do. So they're not really, not only is that not their expertise, it's probably not their interest. So you would almost need like a flora enforcement wing of the warden service. And then it would have to be made up of this really strange kind of person who's interested in both plant ID and law enforcement. You know what I mean? Like I don't know a lot of, like I know I have a lot of friends in law enforcement. I've trained with a lot of folks in law enforcement. That there's a general, like just stereotyping generally, that type of person's very different than the people I know. I also know a lot of botanists and a lot of ethnobotanists and archeo or paleobotanists. Like those people have a completely, usually, I'm sure somebody's going to write me after and be like, I'm a police officer and a botanist, but not common, right? You know what I'm saying? Like two different type of mindsets. So how do that's another challenge, is like finding the people who can actually enforce this stuff or understand even what it is they see in your basket.
Yep. That would be a challenge. I think you could immediately take mushrooms off of the enforcement list, though, because I don't think that they'd even need to be enforced. I think that you just have somebody buy a mushroom license and then you're good. Because as you and Tim talked about in that podcast you guys did last week, they're not really unsustainable to harvest.
What if that? Okay, so chaga though, and I say this as a person who I like to imagine myself as one of the folks who helped popularize the mushroom in the last 15 years. Let's say I've been producing a chaga product for 15 years. Very proud of it. I have a couple of, so I live here on 32 acres, and I've got a couple of chaga growing on some of my birches, and I haven't harvested them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm letting them grow to maturity, and it's nice to be able to observe them. And I wouldn't like it if somebody came here and cut one off, They are as a sclerotium, they're a little bit different than other fruit bodies. And so again, I'm not bringing this up as a contrarian. I harvest chaga, but this is something that it's not like I think what you're referencing is the idea that the studies have so far shown that you can't really overharvest mushroom fruit bodies. But what do you think about something like chaga? Because while I do think most of the ones getting harvested are pretty restricted to close to trails, I don't think people are going deep into the forests and finding the chagas that are in there. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, again, like extraordinarily different than most people. I wrote a whole blog on my website called Chaga Myths and Legends. And the whole blog was a deep dive into looking at how the harvest of chaga is inherently not an unsustainable activity, because you're actually harvesting something that doesn't even make spores. It doesn't affect the growth in any way, because as you and Tim talked about, the growth is inside the tree. Mm-hmm. That's the body. So like when people say, like, especially you get people like Paul Stamets, who is peddling chaga products, who says,
I would say he sells, he grows chaga mycelia on grain-based substrates and sells the mycelial biomass, right? So yes. he's actually like a chaga farmer, so to speak. And when people buy chaga from him, they're not buying the sclerotium that we are talking about. They're buying the mycelia that he's grown, correct?
Yes, that is exactly right. But so why I say that is because he has a vested interest in telling you to not harvest from wild sources.
Agreed. Yeah.
So while I love and support most of the things that man says, and I have been an avid person who's stuck up for him for over the years, because I think he makes mycology very popular for the masses. I think his ideas on chaga are completely wrong. And I say that because when you harvest the chaga, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but you take one of those sclerotia off the trees, you come back a couple years later and it's back again.
Yeah, until that tree dies.
Until that tree dies. And that's the other thing, is that chaga is actually killing the tree. So to spread that sort of information that, like, oh my God, you're taking all of the chaga. It's like, no, I'm actually not. Like, we don't even see infections, they think, for upwards of 20 years. So like, how many birch trees are on your property right now that are already infected that you won't know about for another 15 to 20 years?
Yeah. If I was having to guess, I would say 50 to 100. Just based on how much chaga I see forming. I have a couple of good ones, and then I have a bunch that are forming. And so there must be so many more that haven't shown any signs yet.
Yeah. And then the other thing with chaga is that, like you said, most of the time it's people taking them near trails, right? Because it's the same thing with hunting. There's this inherent laziness. People don't really want to walk off trail. They don't want to get lost. So they stick to the trails, and then they go, oh, I didn't see any chaga today when I stayed only on trails. And so that means that chaga is overharvested.
Now, let's play devil's advocate here, not on chaga necessarily, but on this conversation in general, because it's like, hey man, well, what about bison? What about the passenger pigeon, golden seal, ginseng? There's like, there are plenty of examples of people harvesting things right into extinction. Yep. or right to the edge of extinction, into horrible genetic bottlenecks. And in fact, there's so many examples that the average person, and you kind of brought it up before. So let's say you live in, I don't think it's just that you live in an urban environment, because a lot of folks who are ecologically aware do live in urban environments. But oftentimes there's people living in urban environments who don't understand the nuance of the issue, but they want to do good. So they, make blanket statements about things that they think they're understanding, but don't necessarily fully understand. So, I can completely understand why. So it's not even really a criticism. It's just like, it makes sense. They're not out there. Fisheries regulation can be like this sometimes, but that said, wow. Can we find some examples of, the humpback whale, the right whale, animals that were just driven to the brink and we're lucky to still have on the planet, and many of which we might lose in our lifetime. So, knowing that that's what has, people are responding almost like they have extinction PTSD, you know?
Yep.
So when they say this stuff to us, it's not because they're trying to keep us from foraging. Really, it's because they're worried that we're exploiting natural resources, and they think human beings have done that long enough, and it's time that we got it together. And I think what's hard about that is we think we do have it together. We're like, hey, we're part of that solution, and they're acting like we're part of that problem. But it's pretty understandable where they're coming from. So, kind of, how do you think about that?
I think that there was a lot of bad in the world during those times. Unfortunately, people act as if we live in the same mindset that we did 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's just not the case. We are doing so much better with the world and the environment than we ever were, I think, or not ever were, than we were for, a chunk
since the Industrial Revolution or something.
Yeah. Since the Industrial Revolution, like, we're doing pretty dang good. I mean, when you look at just the beaver harvest, for instance, that's another one where people will tell me all the time, like, beavers are almost extinct. and I'll be like,
I get that from people too, Clay.
They say beavers are almost extinct, and I tell them the annual harvest in Michigan alone. and they go, what? Yeah. I didn't even know that many existed in the country.
Right. Yeah. So I get that a lot from people because I live in a place that is very beaver rich. Like, we're just not, the small number of trappers out there are not having any kind of meaningful impact on beaver populations, but there are places that were historically beaver range, where beavers have been extirpated. What a great example of that is England. It's a fantastic example. So thinking about that, it's like, comes back to what you said before. It's place-based. It's like, yes, where you are, that's the problem. But where I am, that's not a problem. And where I am, we probably should take some beavers. And where you are, yes, it makes sense if you don't. I respect that decision and thank you. But we can't apply that thinking to everywhere. It wouldn't make sense. I've had a lot of the same thing happen with bears too. I mean, there are people who just believe black bears are endangered. I mean, I hear it all the time from people, and it's like, hey, in Maine, we're actually over what we call our social carrying capacity. We have too many black bears here for the amount of people that are living here. Certainly the landscape can support them, but the people are intolerant of their numbers. We have something like 30 to 50,000 black bears in Maine, and it's we have an extremely sustainable harvest here. And the regulators the biologists want to increase the take on bears. But people just think, oh, bear, I don't know why. Bears are endangered. I don't know where they get that idea from, but it's just sort of a popular opinion that's held. So a lot of times, it's like there's people need to be aware, I guess, of what's going on in the specific place where they are. But some of these ideas, it has nothing to do with reality at all. It's just sort of like I don't know if it's like a meme or something, like a pervasive mind virus.
Yeah. The black bear thing is the same here. Our population grows every year, and yet even our regulations are such that, like, not everybody can get a tag. We don't have as many bears as you guys do, but we still do have a lot.
Yeah, so I think, I do think that there must be some way that we could, because if we had foraging licenses, I think people would have a little bit more of a realistic expectation too about what's out there, what's appropriate, all those kind of things. That would probably help, because I think some folks imagine hunting is completely unregulated, and that when you go out there, you're just doing whatever you feel like doing with a gun. And, I mean, you can't blame them. They don't know. They just are unaware. But for folks who know that it's a highly regulated thing, there's a lot, like, they can rest at night, not worrying what you're doing, And so I think if we had some kind of foraging regulation that was more pervasive, people would be able to, like, rest a little bit, maybe. And it sounds like into what you're speaking about with Leeks is kind of get off their soapbox a little bit too.
Well, maybe get off their soapbox, but also, like, if we had regulation, one of the things that I actually like to imagine licensing as is just me paying to make the landscape a more edible place. So,
yeah, well said. Well said.
So it's not like, I actually don't view it as somebody restricting my rights. I view it as being like a part of the reason these things exist on the landscape and maybe are even more abundant. Right.
Yeah.
So like when you harvest ducks, right, you have to buy a federal duck tag. Like you're buying your federal duck stamp.
Yep.
That goes into, and I tell this to people all the time. If you want more wild rice on the landscape, buy duck stamps.
Yeah.
Um,
Well said, because obviously you're supporting wetland habitat that is not just for ducks, right?
Exactly. So that's why I think that regulations and licensing is actually like, you could look at it two ways. You look at it as like somebody's taking my rights, or you could look at it as like I'm a part of the reason that there's so many of these plants even here.
What do you think about, so I think we kind of agree on this, like we sort of see the big picture of regulating foraging in some kind of hopefully nuanced way as a positive thing, or something that it's inevitable, I think. I mean, that's kind of how I see it, particularly with so many of us doing our work to popularize it. What do you think about the role foragers play in the social media world? And I hate the idea, at one level, I think it's like, I found your memes very funny. And I understand sort of where you're coming from on that. But it also is like, oh man, it's like, the idea of the foraging world all getting divided and, this place where people are arguing all the time. It's like, oh, I don't want that. Like, what's the role, or how do we use social media in your mind in a responsible way as foragers? Because we all love to post about what we're harvesting, what we're eating, I mean, I know with hunting, it can be a challenge. It's like, I harvest an animal successfully. I like to post a picture and tell the story of it, but some people get like offended by it. Some people think you shouldn't do it. Some people think, well, you shouldn't promote it because you're promoting something that leads to trophyism, and you're promoting something that leads to, too many people getting involved. You just get all that kind of pushback. So what are your thoughts on foragers and how we use social media?
I think that social media can be used for good, and I don't know if you actually saw, but Sam Thayer recently got on social media.
No, where? Which platform?
He got a Facebook profile, and then, as odd as it sounds, I can't believe it, he has a TikTok.
That's so good though, because like, Instagram's kind of like where is getting to where Facebook got to, where it was kind of like, it's getting kind of old. And yeah. I like that he jumped onto something a little, I know that TikTok is not exactly fresh, but it is where there's a little more energy these days, I think.
Well, I gotta say, I don't have a TikTok, so I've only been able to watch his videos. I've only been able to watch his videos by clicking on a link and seeing it through a window.
Yeah.
But I will say that in comparison to other people's videos on TikTok, his videos are refreshing. They speak to an audience that has a like an invested interest in learning something that doesn't take just 30 seconds. He's got these extraordinarily long TikTok videos. Like some of them are like 4 or 5 minutes long.
You're allowed to do that on TikTok?
Yeah, I didn't know that either. And his videos aren't glitchy. They're not like herky jerky like a lot of them are. Like like
that staccato way that they do the frames. Yeah.
Yeah, but that all of that stuff is eroding like our ability to have a long attention span.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
absolutely.
So like Sam's videos are the antithesis of that. He's got these videos that are actually like, you need to have a good attention span to watch his videos, but they're totally important. I mean, he's only made like 5 or 6 videos now, but they're all really cool and informative videos.
Man, I'm excited to see some of that. I had no idea. Yeah, and to your point about attention spans, I was just sort of kind of joking with some friends recently, but also I'm a bit serious. It's like making a TV show, it runs 30 minutes, but it's really 22 minutes of content. And I'm aware that not everybody has the attention span to watch a TV show anymore. And I thought that was funny because I was thinking about when I was a kid and there was no internet and there was no social media, of course, no texting and all of that. TV was seen as a thing that was eroding our attention span. Like, nobody can read a book anymore, and now it's like nobody can watch a 22-minute TV show anymore. It's too long. They'd rather watch, little clips. So that is funny. And so then the idea of somebody like Sam jumping onto TikTok is just, and then using it sort of in a way that's not really meant to be used. That's very funny to me. I appreciate that
Yeah.
a lot.
But
Yeah.
speaking to your earlier question though, like how can we as foragers make the social media experience better for all of us? I think it would be to get out of this groupthink mentality, sort of embrace the fact that we all live in different environments and trust other people's judgments from their landscape. So like when you tell me that you harvest only leaves and that's a sustainable harvest for you or for Arthur, um, I'm going to trust you guys because you have a lot of experience and I'm going to listen to you and the things that you say. And I'm not going to say, well, that's stupid. you know, I don't want to have those sorts of judgments. I don't want to be divided. I want all of us to come together. And I actually think that due to the like way our soil is eroding, I think learning these skills is going to be extraordinarily important for the years to come in the future. And I think that we almost have like a mission as people in this space to like sort of make sure we plant a lot of edible perennial species and get them out on the landscape so that when soils do finally give out, there are still foods available for the people that are here to eat.
Man, that's wow, you just took us in a different direction there. I want to piggyback on that. I saw today a post you had put up about a friend of yours who passed.
Yep.
And you were mentioning that he was into that very thing. And you also said, you brought up the word nuance. You said he was a nuanced thinker and that he believed in planting edible landscapes. And I want to give you some space to talk about that, either about him specifically or just about those ideas, because, you know, you'd think this is kind of obvious. I think, and actually I want to add a couple more little pieces to that. I want to just go back a second and say, you mentioned when I had Tim Clemens on recently, and he said something like, he said something to the effect of, well, to me, when I say foraging, that means sustainably. If you're not doing that, you're not foraging, you're poaching. And I thought, oh, that's one way, is to put a little social pressure on the term so that the term is inherently referring to the sustainable practices. So that when somebody is being unsustainable with how they forage, we won't call it foraging. You know, that's like just one way that people can kind of self-police and self-regulate a little bit.
Yep.
But anyway, the idea, you know, we talked about in that episode too, just I was telling a story of apple trees that were cut down because people didn't like me picking the apples. And
Yep.
the idea of cutting down food producing plants for no reason other than the people are eating the food that comes off the plants is kind of abhorrent to me. And the fact that we haven't invested as a culture in edible landscapes is very bizarre. It's quite strange. So anyway, yeah, I want to just give you space to speak to all of that, to your friend, the idea of edible landscapes, and to sort of, you know, how we can kind of create that for the future.
Yeah. So my friend Jonathan Aylward, he passed away in February, and he was an extraordinarily loved and universally embraced individual in our community. And none of us can really understand, you know, why he took his life, but he did. And that's what he wanted, and that's what he got in the end. And we're all going to just try to carry on the message that he had for the world at the time and what he wanted. You know, I think he just got really depressed after 2 years of isolation in the pandemic. But he and I had met a long time ago at like a plant medicine ceremony, and instantaneously became like very good friends because he had this idea of like wanting to plant things out. And I had actually already been doing it. So we have this series of trails here in Traverse City that are called the Tart Trails. They're bike trails. And I had been planting edible species along them for quite a while, but I had just been doing it like without any permission. And Jonathan came along, and he was willing to do all the bureaucratic nonsense that I can't stand. So he was willing to talk to people, fill out paperwork, and do all that stuff. And due to his work, we now have a couple places here in town that are called the Edible Trails projects. And what these are, they're little edible oases that exist along these bike trails. So so it's like really cool. You know, to this day, you can go and pick currants and josta berries and gooseberries, and there's small mulberry trees and some apple trees, slower growing species as well that will eventually be fruiting, you know, like nut trees, things of that nature.
Wow, that's a cool legacy for him to leave behind, you know, something that will last, will hopefully last.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb here and sound like a total weirdo. I don't think that that's the last time I'll see him. I think that I'll see him again. I think he's, you know, he got what he wanted, and I think he's a lot happier than he was. So,
wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing that post today. Suicide's a crazy experience to go through, man. I mean, I've lost several friends that way, and it's something that I vacillate back and forth between, like, not being able to understand and being like hurt by it, and then also seeing it as an incredible act of bravery just to step into the unknown like that. It's like I'm not really sure which it is. Like, I don't know if it's like a selfish thing to do, or if it's an incredibly courageous thing to do. You know,
I think
it's either one. You know.
Well, we're talking about nuance here. Maybe it's both.
Yeah. I mean, it takes tremendous courage. Like the idea of stepping out into death, like consciously, and I mean, yeah, like it's a programmed fear in every organism. So to overcome that is really interesting to me. But then it's also so traumatic to the people who you leave behind too. So yeah, I'm conflicted about it, but I certainly have lost many friends like that over the years, and you know, it's challenging to not have the ability to get the closure sometimes that you wish you could have. You know, so anyway, I guess, but there's something cool about those trees and, you know, those plants that are there. It's like a living memory of him, not just a memory.
Yeah, and then I hope to someday actually have like carry on that legacy in a larger way. I do aspire to one day buy. Yeah, I actually aspire to one day get a large tract of land that I can have managed for native edible species and maybe a couple non-natives as well. But that maybe we can have like a park, you know, that like literally you come and you pay like, you know, $5 or whatever, or maybe you have a membership and you can come in and harvest whatever you want as long as you go with the regulations.
Maybe that's the future, man. It's like a high fence operation, you know, for foraging, right? It's like foraging safari trips. You know what I mean?
Well,
like, oh wow. I never thought.
Well, I wasn't really envisioning it as a high fence operation, but
no, but you get what I'm saying. These like places where you go hunt, where it's a little more guaranteed. You know, it's not necessarily a totally canned thing, but it's like huge tracts of land, and when you're inside there, it's private, and you pay for what you harvest or something like that. I don't know. I'm just wondering how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I mean, I personally believe that one thing that I would love to say is like about our division is that I think that the whole entire movement, like a lot of things, is kind of always divided from the inside, whereas we should be looking at like the real culprit in unsustainability, which would be in the case of chaga or even wild leeks, is deforestation.
Agreed.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, it's like everybody's pointing the finger at other foragers when we should be pointing it at like Weyerhaeuser, you know.
I always felt around the vegans that when you have a vegan like ripping you up and down about a piece of meat you're eating, and you want to just be like, do you know about McDonald's? Like, are you aware of Burger King? Like, really, me? You're gonna take, like, you think that your efforts aimed against me are making change in the world? Like, there's some places that make more sense for, if you really believe this, there's places that are better investments of your energy, like bigger fish to fry, so to speak. So it just does seem like, is the problem really a person who's using chaga medicinally, or is it the fact that we're cutting down, so much of our forests for development or for other reasons? So yeah, that's a really good point. But something I learned a long time ago was that in psychology, it's something like when you get a group together of more than 10 people, like once you hit a certain number, there's like a critical threshold, and then the group tends to split into two factions. So that's just like that might be like why bee colonies, what is it called, that when they swarm,
Yeah.
and or like a tribe grows to a certain size and then it like breaks off into two foraging groups or something like that. So that might be part of like the natural sociology, of humans. And so we're a big enough thing that we have like different factions, and then the factions argue, because you see, it seems kind of universal, right? It's hard to picture a huge movement where everybody like kind of agrees on everything, maybe that's not really realistic.
I would hope that people could get to some sort of agreement, at least with what I said earlier, is like an agreement to trust other foragers and other places, that maybe the things that they're seeing are true and we can trust them about those things.
Yeah, that's a good point, or at least enough wisdom and humility to not speak too strongly about things that we haven't witnessed personally or places we haven't been.
Exactly.
Like even if I guess what I mean is, even if you don't trust what people are doing there, it's like, hey, but I'm not there, so probably shouldn't say anything to like go and learn about it myself in person, have an educated opinion,
A good example of that would be, I once hitchhiked down the Baja Peninsula in Mexico, and they have such tight water restrictions. It's like you're only allowed to use like 10 gallons of water a day or something, or maybe even less than that, for hand washing and cleaning and everything for your whole house. And then I live 4 minutes from a Great Lake.
Yeah.
So like somebody telling me like, oh, you need to take shorter showers to like save water. I'm like, dude, I don't need to save water here.
Right. Yeah. I completely. I mean, do I ever get that? It's like, because I'll have that too, where especially around water. Being in New England, it's like, how much of the year I got to wear rubber boots because it's wet everywhere here. But I go to Arizona all the time, and it's like, man, I'll take my showering habits there, let's say, and it's like, oh, dude, pull it together.
Yeah.
Like there's not a drop to be found. So you got to change your practices and stuff. And the homogeneity that we live with now, because it's like you go town to town to town to town across the country, and you see the same stores, and it's the same Cisco food and all the same chain restaurants, and everything at the built level is kind of the same. So you can imagine, if you don't understand the ecology, how you would almost miss that. You're like, what are you talking about? It's the same supermarkets, it's the same clothing stores, it's the same mall, it's the same car dealerships. It's like all the same stuff in Arizona as it is in Maine, but it's like, yeah, but check out the water situation. So yeah, no, that's a really good point.
So I just wanted to say that for those of you who do live in city environments and you can't harvest leeks, or maybe you don't want to because it's unsustainable where you live, there is a species of onion called Allium X Proliferum. It's also known as like an Egyptian walking onion. This is ultimately sustainable. In fact, it can become a nuisance on your land. And while it doesn't have the same taste of a wild leek, I think that it is such a good like plant to have in your landscape to supply that sort of oniony taste to your meals if you don't have access to wild leeks.
This is something you would plant, or something that's an invasive where you live?
I don't think it can really become an invasive species. This is a plant that has, instead of seeds, it's got little bulbs on top of it.
Oh, right. They fall over and replant themselves?
Yep. So it can become like invasive on your property, but like maybe in your garden, but it's not going to become like a locally invasive species. I don't think it could ever do that.
Yeah. One thing that's clear to me, at least in the way that I cook, is like I have to have an allium. It can be a store-bought onion, it can be garlic, it can be wild leeks, but like most dishes that I cook are going to have an allium in them. So, but it doesn't have to be a specific allium. It's
Hmm.
just that I really like to have that as a component of my cooking. And so the idea of switching around different ones is also like cool and fun and exciting. I mean, I only have leeks for a short period of the year anyway, but any of the wild alliums, I don't know, they're pretty exciting to me.
Absolutely. I think that they're a great thing to have in your diet. So I just believe that like we should all have a ton of thankfulness for the foods and the earth that we are, that supplies us all this food and this wonderful beauty, and it's something that I think about all the time with the leeks, with all of the food that I harvest. And thankfulness is a huge part of it. And I have a story actually, if you'd let me tell, that would show about like the thankfulness and like what the earth provides. And it's actually a very surreal story if you'll let me tell it.
Oh, please do.
Okay, so I live in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan. And then last year I went to the upper peninsula to do some work on a house because I'm a carpenter. So I was working on a cabin, and it just so happened that I was going to be up there for the duck opener. So I brought all my duck decoys, I brought my shotgun, and I had been working on this cabin all day, and I thought, I'm going to go out for an evening hunt after work, and it's going to be great. And I get all the stuff in the car, and I'm driving down the road, and I'm a huge fan of kirtan music, which is kind of a weird thing.
Good for the soul, man.
Yeah. So
Real
I'm
good for the soul.
So kind of a unique experience. Like I'm driving down the road to go hunting, but I'm listening to kirtan. So I'm driving, and it's many miles, and it's a sunny, beautiful day, and I'm thinking to myself how thankful I am. I'm like, oh my God, the world provides everything. And I was just kind of like having this blissed out day. And I come up over this hill, and I see a deer that had just gotten hit by the car that was coming towards me. So I see the deer go down into the ditch on the side of the road. And I think to myself, okay, I guess I'm not going duck hunting today.
Venison's on the menu.
Yeah. So I go and I stop my car. The other car didn't even stop. Obviously, I guess that's pretty common. I go over, and the deer's not dead yet. So I had to dispatch it, unfortunately, which is always not a very fun thing to do. But as I mentioned earlier, Michigan has a healthy bear population, and it probably would have been eaten alive by bears had I not done that. But either way, after I put it out of its misery, I say to myself, "Oh, I don't have a knife on me," and I turn around and I look down on the ground, and I'm not kidding you, Daniel. There's a perfectly sharp fillet knife laying on the ground right next to the body of the deer.
What?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. and I had like a moment of a freak out a little bit. I go, what? That wasn't there a minute ago.
Like rub your eyes and look again, kind of a thing.
Yeah, like I'm like, what? But here's where it gets even weirder. So I had shot a 10-point buck 2 seasons ago, and the only knife I had in my backpack was a fillet knife. So the symbolism there was so bizarre to me. Like, why was it a fillet knife? And like I said, the whole thing, I'm like blissed out driving down the road, feeling like thankful for everything and how the earth provides everything. And then I turn around, and there's a knife laying there
next to a deer.
And it's so specific. It's a fillet knife, and I'm thinking like this is so strange, and it had to have been one of the most surreal moments of my life. Like I went to bed that night feeling like, I had seen behind the veil.
Yeah, exactly. Those kind of experiences are most people when you get them alone will tell you they have stories like that, that are like kind of hard to reconcile with the mechanistic view of reality.
Yeah.
And man, it's funny because it's I don't think that people always believe exactly what they pretend they believe. Maybe I'll just say that. I think people are open to a much more what's the word? Kind of like a magical.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
like a psychedelic experience of life, like that.
Yeah.
That's how it felt to me. Like I felt like this is unreal. Like, did this really just happen?
A lot of the religions of the world, they make a lot more sense when you think about a computer-based model. I'm not saying our universe is a simulation or a computer or anything like that, but that's like one of these ideas that's been put forward into the public consciousness in the last decade or so. And like, for instance, if you take like the biblical story of Jesus and you're like, oh, Jesus is God, but he's also makes himself a man, that whole thing where you're like, that just sounds crazy. But then you imagine if you were a computer programmer and you had programmed all of these characters, and then you could somehow download yourself into the game so you could go teach the characters something. It's like, well, that makes perfect sense to me. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of like things make sense when you look at them like that. But yeah, like I also, I wanted to say, I had somebody tell me years ago, and this is always, he lived by this idea that everything you need is always within 50 feet. So he would always do this game. It'd be like, we'd need something like, oh, we need a calculator. And they'd be like, all right, everybody spread out. And it'd be like, inevitably we would always find, like the thing is never that far away that you need, and he would always do that, I think, to illustrate how important your mindset was about what the universe provides, and that everything you need is always there. And, yeah, I really live by that as well. Now, that said, we were talking about the nuance and the contrast earlier. I can't seem to find any passenger pigeons. So I know there's limits on these things, but no, I really like that story, man. That's fascinating. And yeah, just to kind of agree that the universe is a pretty benevolent place and life's pretty abundant. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
It's a very abundant place. I love it. I love foraging. I love teaching this stuff. I love everything about it. It's really fun. And I think that it just brings us closer to being a part of the community rather than this disjunct member.
Yeah. And I think that's like really important right now, because I think a lot of people do feel like a little bit disconnected, and, it's a way to plug back in. So, yeah, man, thanks for what you do. And anything people should know you have coming up?
I have a ton of classes coming up on the schedule. I've got a class that I'm teaching right outside of Detroit, Michigan on June 18th. I have a birch bark basket class I'll be teaching in July.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm even supposed to be teaching a class down in North Carolina.
Oh, cool. Right on.
So
tell people where they find that.
My website is www.nomiforager.com. That's NOMI forager.com. You can also find me and all my crazy memes on Clay 2_Bowers on Instagram. And I just want to say that as far as this goes, like the whole leek conversation, I'm in total support of sustainability. And I want to just reiterate that over and over and over again. The reason that I harvest bulbs is because we can in my environment.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing us back to the nuance thing, because it's important that we don't get too far off track with arbitrary rules that don't apply everywhere. And so I appreciate your perspective. So thanks for sharing it with us today.
Yeah, no problem, man.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.